I'll bring you this.
I think I see it. It's behind there. No, he's gone. That's right there. Can you see that? All right.
I think that one.
No, this is mine.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessie Newman, and I'm a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. I'm a sophomore from Atlanta, Georgia, majoring in international relations. It is an honor to be sitting among these panelists here today, who will be speaking on the responsibility to protect doctrine, known in shorthand as R2p. R2p found its origin in the 1990s and 2000s, emerging from the conflict and violence, the Rwandan genocide, and the Balkans War. Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, delivered a report to the UN General Assembly where he presented the international community with the events of the 1990s, where they had failed to act and respond to human atrocities. He then encouraged them at this critical juncture in time, as a union of member states, to approach the future with a more comprehensive and direct mindset and method to protect both the rights and security of their world citizens from violence and oppression. The next few years will bring the development of R2p. The future of R2p is complicated, especially as it is so often cited in the Libyan conflict of 2011. Many question whether it will be a strong influence in the primacy of human security on the international stage. This panel will discuss the international politics behind R2p, including topics such as the United Nations, transnational relationships, international organizations, and more specific groups. Today's humanitarian crisis of the Rohingya in Myanmar is an important consideration for this panel. Unfortunately, one of our panelists today, Dr. Simon Adams, had his flight canceled. He graciously then took a train from DC to Providence, where a tree fell on the railway, and he is now stuck on the train there. But I personally really appreciate all the efforts he took in order to try to share his insights on this really important topic.
Maybe we would just call.
Yeah, FaceTime?
Use technology.
For the logistics of the panel, each panelist will have 12 minutes for their opening remarks. With the help of our timer here, after 10 minutes, it will transform from green to yellow, in which you will have a 2-minute remainder of time. After all the panelists have had the chance to speak, there will be time for conversation amongst the panelists, and then hopefully I will get one question myself, and then we will turn it over to all of you, who can then ask panelists pressing question that you have yourself. So for the panelists that are here, that have been able to make it, going first, we'll have Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman. Dr. Cronin-Furman is the author of Just Enough, The Politics of Accountability for Mass Atrocities. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and has practiced law in Cambodia, New York, and The Hague. Next, we'll have Professor John Packer. Professor Packer is currently an associate professor of law and director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Professor Packer has held academic positions at the University of Essex, where he was the director of the world-renowned Human Rights Center, and at our very own Fletcher School at Tufts University. And finally, we'll have Mr. Sergey Kislitsyn, where he is currently a research fellow at the Center for North American Studies at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations and the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Cronin-Furman, if you would like to start us off.
Well, thank you all for coming out and risking getting blown away to Oz today. It's nice to see so many people here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the international politics of R2p and why it has been so difficult to prevent mass atrocities. Can everyone hear me okay? So in the spring of 2009, thousands of Sri Lankan Tamils huddled on a beach, waiting for the international community to save them from the relentless shelling of the Sri Lankan military. No help came. The UN estimates that more than 40,000 people may have died in the final days of the war there. Credible evidence suggests that surrendering combatants were extrajudicially executed, that civilians were tortured, that women were raped, and more than 100,000 civilians were actually impounded in what were essentially concentration camps for months or even years after the end of the conflict. While this happened, the international community stood by and watched. 9 years later, no one has been punished for any of these crimes. In Syria, over the last 7 years, half of the population has been displaced from their homes. Tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands, have directly suffered brutal violence by the regime and other actors in the conflict. The UN Security Council has debated action on this crisis several times, but ultimately that's come to nothing. The US actually launched limited airstrikes against the Syrian regime over their use of chemical weapons. But again, the violence continues, and in fact, use of chemical weapons continues. Today, nearly 750,000 Rohingya Burmese have fled across the border into Bangladesh. They are running from a vicious crackdown by the Burmese military. They carry with them stories of absolutely horrific abuses, of particularly brutal forms of sexual violence, of targeting of very young children and babies. These abuses are so appalling that even the very experienced aid workers working in the refugee camps are shocked. And these are people who have been everywhere and seen everything. So at the very least, what's happening to the Rohingya today and what has been happening over the last 6 months is ethnic cleansing that qualifies as crimes against humanity and may even rise to the level of genocide. And I'm not going to get into the legal analysis here, but I'd be happy to discuss it in the Q&A. Now, this violence is shocking, but it isn't surprising. The world saw this coming. The Rohingya are often referred to as the world's most persecuted minority. They have been denied citizenship rights, so they are restricted from seeking higher education. They're often prevented from marrying and bearing children freely. And for the past several years, many of them have actually been forcibly confined to IDP camps and urban ghettos, all in the name of security. Now, Burma says that the current violence is a counterinsurgency that was triggered by attacks by a Rohingya militant group against Burmese military and police installations last August. However, this current campaign of violence actually started a year earlier. And we have a February 2017 UN report that documents exactly the same types of violations that we're seeing today, just on a smaller scale. We've also seen similar attacks by the Burmese military against this minority in both 1977 and 1992. So the world had plenty of warning, unfortunately, that something terrible was going to happen to the Rohingya. And the question remains, why hasn't anyone done anything to save them? This is the subject of our panel here today, the responsibility to protect, and that's a global commitment to prevent atrocity crimes. As Jesse told us, this has been endorsed by all UN member states in 2005. But each of these crises that I mentioned, Sri Lanka, Syria, the Rohingya crisis, have happened since that commitment. So what's going on? Has R2p failed? The bedrock principle of international relations and international law is sovereignty. And this means that states have supreme authority within their territory. They're the only legitimate users of violence, and no one can sit in judgment over their actions. And what that means is that international efforts to prevent and punish mass atrocities have to work within the system of sovereign states. So they don't trump sovereignty, they work around it. An example of this, the International Criminal Court. We hear a lot of people saying that Assad should be taken to The Hague. We hear people saying now that Aung San Suu Kyi should be taken to The Hague. But the International Criminal Court is a treaty body. You can't take anyone to The Hague against their will if they are government officials. And that's because states select in to the ICC. They sign up for it. Under a limited set of circumstances, the UN Security Council can refer something there. So we saw that happen in Sudan and in Libya. But in general, it's very hard to try anyone who hasn't consented to the court's jurisdiction. Additionally, the court is based actually on what's called complementary jurisdiction. So the primary responsibility to try atrocity crimes rests with the states where they occur. The court only acts when those states are unwilling or unable. And similarly, the responsibility to protect foregrounds sovereignty in the same way. So although we mostly hear about it in terms of the international community's responsibility to protect, actually, the primary responsibility, again, rests with the sovereign state. The international community can only act when that state, again, is unable or unwilling to take the actions that it should. And the international community can only use force when it is authorized by the UN Security Council, again, a sovereignty-reinforcing institution. So, because these institutions, ICC, R2p, are formed in the image of the international system, of course they reflect its power dynamics. And what this means, as we've seen with the ICC, is that there's a very real imbalance in who ends up the subject of these interventions. So the ICC is often criticized as an African criminal court, and that's because most of the people who the court has sought the arrest of, sought to charge, have been sub-Saharan Africans. The reason for that is not that the court is hunting Africans, as some have said, but that many other countries are insulated from its jurisdiction. The US is not a member, China is not a member, Russia is not a member, India is not a member. And that results in a very imbalanced looking list of indictees. The same effects are at play with regard to R2p, right? So we saw R2p being advanced as justification for international action in Libya. We have not seen international action in Syria. One clear explanation for that is that Muammar Gaddafi was basically an international pariah at the point where the international community went in. Syria, of course, is protected by powerful allies. Additionally, any kind of international intervention relies on states to take the initiative, which they're only really going to do when it's in their interests. And this means that we really have to manage our expectations. Neither the ICC nor the responsibility to protect are system revolutionizing developments, right? These are essentially focal points to organize around. So, think about the microdynamics of how response to atrocities occur. You have violations occurring, for instance, the Rohingya crisis. What happens is members of the victim community, at great personal risk to themselves, get information out to the international community. So with regard to the Rohingya, we have individuals recording things with their smartphones, smuggling that out, passing it through the diaspora to activists and advocates at the international level. Those advocates then put pressure on foreign policy bureaucracy in the West. To talk about this in the very nitty-gritty, members of human rights groups, members of diaspora groups meet with desk officers in the US State Department. They meet with low-level officials in the Canadian government, and they pass information about what's happening, and they ask for action. This information also goes to the big international organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. It goes to UN human rights officials. People write op-eds in major newspapers. All of this applies pressure on foreign policy officials in the government. And eventually that goes up the chain to decision makers, right? So when you have something like R2p alongside of this chain of pressure and information, it's not going to make a policymaker care about something they otherwise wouldn't, right? The fact that we have R2p now, that states have committed to this responsibility to protect, is not enough to change a state's fundamental interests. It's not enough to change, what a decision maker cares about. But it does change the conversation. So at every stage, it's kind of another thumb on the scale, which makes it easier to act if that is the impulse. So if the government does want to intervene, now they have this law, this obligation to appeal to. And it also offers a way to push back against apathy, right? This is something that advocates, that activist members of the foreign policy apparatus can point to and say is an obligation to act. But again, we have to manage our expectations, right? It doesn't change the interests, it just operates on the margins. So to sort of conclude by answering the question about the future of R2p and the liberal world order, I think we can say that failing to prevent atrocities is actually a feature, not a bug, of the international liberal world order, right? This is something that's baked into the system. And R2p, at best, is a patch on that bug. It's not a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Packard?
Packard, not Packard, like the street.
Oh.
Sorry. One on Green Bay. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and thanks for allowing me to observe yesterday evening and this morning. And I have to say, I really wish that I was a student in your program. Very impressive, particularly by the questions that have been put and the kind of quality considerations and reflections that have inspired them. So, bravo for that. It's also nice to be back here. I was only here for a year. I was a visiting professor, and I enjoyed it very much. At a time when people were worried about the re-election of Bush Jr., just to give you some context, worried about the re-election of Bush Jr. Things have changed. Let me just say also that it is my view that Fletcher School, I'd just like to commend you that I think Fletcher School is the preeminent school of international relations in the United States of America, and of course, in the world. And yesterday and today was only demonstrated that estimation is correct. So bravo, keep it up. Okay, speaking about responsibility to protect, first of all, I have to admit to a degree of nervousness because I'm sitting in front of Alan Rock, who was a principal actor in this, and particularly in the outcome document of 2005 in the United Nations. So my interpretations are those more of an observer, although I was very active in a number of the situations and met many of the people involved in the elaboration of both the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty that led up to the 2001 document adopted that was an independent commission set up by the Government of Canada, and in 2001 adopted the Commission document, and then 4 years later the outcome document at the United Nations. So I have a particular perspective on it, but which I'll share in a moment. I'm going to try and be relatively brief because actually I'd like to have more questions and discussion about it, and there are specific stories and recordings about R2p and either its failure or its lack of vigor and different perspectives on it. I'm struck by Steven Pinker's new book saying all of us shouldn't worry about this anyway, things are going quite fine. I think that, well, let's say it's counterintuitive. I look at the world and I'm pretty darn worried. Not only that we have a now declared effectively dictatorship in China with an unending presidency. I was in Berlin the last few days, and while I was in Berlin, Krasnowski in Poland declared not just that Poland is a Christian nation, but it's Christ's nation. 2 journalists, young journalists in Slovakia, were murdered in cold blood while I was there. The events that are actually characterizing not just a liberal world order, but what we would have thought have been the champions and the bastion of post-Second World War order are deeply, deeply disturbing. And the risks are enormous. I don't have to mention Putin's declaration of his nuclear missiles yesterday. So I'm not quite sure what inspires. Pinker's a psychologist, I think, so maybe he's got a different way of looking at the world. But for me, having basically spent my career in international relations, I'm really worried. I can also tell you another thing. I had breakfast the other day with the Turkish ambassador in Canada, and with a delegation visiting from Istanbul. And I won't remark about the content of it, but I'll tell you what's worrying about it. The last Turkish ambassador I had breakfast with has been arrested. So very worrying about who we're even talking to. What is their position? What's our relationship? Dr. Gross mentioned yesterday, about reliability. None of us are sure what we can rely upon at the moment, and that's deeply disturbing. Okay. With that prefatory remarks, let me say that it's too bad Simon isn't here. He would have told us a lot more about R2p and so forth. But my perspective on R2p is that it wasn't new. It certainly wasn't new as a matter of law. I think there are those who declare, I know Gareth Evans for quite a while, like to say normatively we invented something. It's actually to anyone who has studied public international law, and even the formal articulation in the Commission's report, which still relied upon the Security Council determination for actual intervention, that is the Charter of the United Nations. What is striking is that if you come from Mars and you just read the Charter of the United Nations, and then you look at the real politics of the world, you might see a pretty big gap, a gap between declaration or vision and actual conduct and behavior. And the problem and the antecedents of R2p was this gap was ever present in 1999 specifically. And the situation, actually earlier than that, the situation in former Yugoslavia, but more particularly leading up to what then became an intervention without Security Council authorization. This was, I remember Lloyd Axworthy, who was my member of parliament actually at the time. And there was a wonderful photo on the front page of the Financial Times where it was him and Madeleine Albright, and I forget all the different people, and they looked sick because they were 78 days into bombing and they weren't sure it was going to work. And they did not have a Security Council resolution. I remember not too long after that, there was a big debate, and thank God, Milosevic withdrew his troops and so forth. It worked. Michael Ignatieff wrote then later about, we have to intervene in our neighborhood where we can and all the kind of logic. But fundamentally, we didn't have a Security Council resolution. That's really troubling for anyone who is committed to the rule of law, to the charter regime and so forth. I'm not saying it was wrong. In fact, what I'm now going to tell you is not too long after that, I was in Paris at a meeting of the French Institute of International Relations, and there was an interesting little debate that took place, actually chaired by David Malone, former, now I think he's the president of your university, right? But he used to be the head of the International Peace Academy at the time. And he was chairing a little panel which had Pravakin and Mattia Tazzari on it. And Pravakin said, look, what the heck is this? This is clearly in breach of the Charter. It's clearly unlawful. To which Tazzari got up and said, yes, it's unlawful, but it's just. Wow, that's really a cause for concern. That's a slippery slope. That's going back hundreds of years. That's just war. It's just, but it doesn't matter. Very troubling. Now, if you read the Commission's report, which is long, I forget how many pages it is, a lot, 70 or 60 or something like that. It has basically three elements to it. Responsibility to prevent, and it states unequivocally that this is the first priority, not just in order, but in importance. Prevention is the core. But it's relatively short, I think 8 to 10 pages. And then it goes into the responsibility to react. And that's the core of it. And at the very end, it ends with the responsibility to rebuild, I think it is, repair, I think to rebuild. And a kind of obligation, if you kind of break it, you're engaged, you have to help your counterparts repair. But the essence of it really was about this intermediate, the middle part. And it was actually about the use of force. And I know some people say it wasn't, but it was really a question, can we find another paradigm which would authorize an action, an intervention, meritorious, where we're faced with such situations that were so egregious? And I remember actually some of the people working, I won't name their names right now, but in the Canadian Foreign Service at the time, who I had conversations with on responsibility to prevent, and they said, forget that, prevention's been tried and failed. At that time, I was the director of the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities, still today the only institution in all of international relations that is dedicated 100% solely to the prevention of violent conflict. No other job, in a limited form in the context of the OSCE, and specifically with regard to minority-majority relations. But we were working, and we were succeeding, actually, I would argue, in managing a lot of potential conflicts. We were created in the shadow of the bloody dissolution of Yugoslavia, and the great fear then was that there would be multiples of these. And specifically, the fear was Russian minorities in neighboring states, but many others, Hungarian minorities in Romania, and we could go on and on. So we had a lot to say about prevention and how that would work, but there was not interest. I have to tell you, there was not interest. It was about the authorization and the paradigm of intervention. Incidentally, later I was involved together at that time with Daniel Turk, who was an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and later became President of Slovenia, in the creation of the Office of the Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide. This is relevant because now we're talking about genocide at the United Nations. That's a very narrow office, but apparently has pretty much failed also. my point is that if we're talking about the reaction and the intervention, and if we're talking even a genocide, the hard end, the far end of this, we're already really late. We are actually too late. The chances of success for turning around the implications of intervention. Samantha Power, who I used to sit beside at Kennedy School for a while, who was advocating at that time with Michael Ignatieff and so forth for the old liberal interventionists, I think they were called, intervention in Darfur. Darfur, this larger than France territorially. People might not know that. A really big place. How do you actually control, I mean, what kind of intervention would be required? This is not Kosovo neighborhood within Europe. Very problematical, very difficult. So the ignoring, and I want to underline this, the ignoring of the responsibility to prevent was a major mistake and is the cause, in my view, for the subsequent discrediting of initiative, because it was seen as what it was, which was a justification for the use of force by those who could. Okay, to go quickly, I want to jump now to, first of all, let's just say the UN Charter paradigm actually foresaw this. Because the revolutionary aspect of the UN Charter is that it didn't just talk about justice between states, which is a Westphalian paradigm, essentially, of sovereign equality, not just about sovereign, but sovereign equality. What the Charter of the United Nations did is said it's not sufficient we have justice between states, we must have justice within states. And justice within states is a matter of international concern. And this is why human rights were included, because before that, you had Chamberlain in 38. What the Third Reich did within its territory for persons who were not the nationals of other states was their affair. 45, we said, no, we stopped that. We know what that caused. And it didn't just cause an egregious example of man's inhumanity to man. It wasn't just the Holocaust. It was the consequences of that for peace and stability across Europe and in the world as a whole. And in 1945, we said, we stopped that. There's an intimate relationship between justice within states and justice between states. And we need a new world order, which says, and if you read simply not only the preamble but Article 1 of the Charter, obligations to respect human rights, which are one of the objects and purposes of the Charter, but are founded also on duties of cooperation. So a new law, Wolfgang Friedman wrote a lot about in Colombia, the law of international cooperation. So this idea as sovereignty as responsibility also has roots in classic international law. The definition of the state, the very definition of the state is not just defined territory, permanent population, but the capacity to enter into relations and be held responsible. It is that dynamic of interstate responsibility which gives the constituent legitimacy to a state in the first place. So the state which is not responsible and doesn't hold the confidence of anyone to be responsible with regard to undertakings is a problem for international relations. So sovereignty as responsibility was there pre-Charter and definitely in the Charter in terms of its interplay. What responsibility protect did and was crucial, which many people, Professor Rock also has observed, is it was a political acknowledgement that we had not acted according to this, and we now needed to act according to it. And in 2005 in New York, I think 170 heads of state and government, I can't remember the number, but it was a very large number, got together and accepted with regard in 3 short paragraphs. They said, at least with regard to 4 specific situations, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide, we will act. There were all sorts of subsequent problems, the veto, how it would be used, and so forth. But the basic commitment, including by the P5, we will act. Now here we are, and we come to the Rohingya. I would just say a couple words about the Rohingya. In 1992-93, I was assistant to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iraq, and I was a special assistant to the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Burma. First public procedure in the Human Rights Commission at the time. And I went to, among other places, Rakhine, northern Rakhine State. And that was just after the second large push of Rohingyas out of Rakhine. The first one was 1978. The second was 1992. 290,000 pushed out. I can just tell you that since then, there has been 26 years of public reporting to the United Nations Human Rights Commission and Council by subsequent special rapporteurs that has identified and listed, and you can read it as a terrible litany of violations. which one professor, Mamzani, has labeled the slow-burning genocide. Amartya Sen has also called it a slow-burning genocide. And we have progressed. I have 10 seconds. Yeah, sorry, my 14 seconds over, sorry. I guess I should stop. But I'll just add a couple more words here. We have progressed now where we have consistently ignored what was in our faces. And the latest events since August 25th, 2017 are only the most recent in 5 major pushes and 40 years of persistent public state policy. In 1982, Burma decided to revise its nationality law and took citizenship away from the Rohingyas. They were citizens from 1948. And I don't have to describe to you, Professor Johnson can describe you basic international law. When Burma became independent in 1948, the population went with the territory and they accepted these people as nationals of the state. 1982, they chose unilaterally to render them stateless, which is a violation of general international law, not to make people stateless. So this has been a consistent pattern, and it is a genocide. You just read the convention. So I don't need R2p, just read the 48 Convention. I don't know if you know, nobody needs to die for there to be violations of the Genocide Convention. That's only one of the main acts. Killing. Forced transfer of populations is another one. Denial, interference in, for example, forced pregnancies or interference in the perpetuation of population. I don't know if you know, but in Burma it was illegal to marry without permission. And if you don't marry under a Muslim community, you're not going to have children. I mean, these were these interferences which were persistent. Complicity in genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide. All of these acts are clearly established. Burma, Myanmar has committed them. And we have done nothing. And this is now the challenge. We are still doing nothing. And worse than that, we hesitate. We don't even call it genocide. Neither Amnesty International nor Human Rights Watch. I'm on the board with Professor Rod. Are you still on the board? Yeah, of Human Rights Watch Canada. But we won't call it genocide. We'll call it ethnic cleansing. Oh, interesting. Ethnic cleansing is not actually a listed crime on any international instrument. There is no convention that binds any state to do anything in response to ethnic cleansing. The Genocide Convention, we are bound inter pares, between states. And this is what I really want to underline for you. It's not just a violation of Burma for the commission of genocide, their duty to prevent and to punish, but there is a problem for the 150 plus odd other states parties to the Genocide Convention that we do nothing in the face of a party that commits genocide. We have a duty to uphold and to insist on the respect of that convention. So here we are faced now with really a crisis of our time, which is the public confidence and the confidence of states that these standards, these fundamental norms, are possibly meaningless. And that's a particular problem of your age and generation. Because what I can tell you is that 25 years ago, in 1992, the internet hardly existed, and there was very little information. I remember going to Burma, there were 56 hardwired landlines for telephones into the country as a whole. They were just bringing in satellite dishes and so on. Let me tell you today, Burma, Myanmar is a connected country, as are many other countries. And the point is that people now know. They can see instantly. We can go on Google Earth and we can see the villages that were destroyed and so forth. We can read the license plates and know we did it. So this is the crisis of confidence. We know it, we see it, we have the norms, and we're not acting. And that's the problem that we face today.
Thank you. Pass the microphone to you.
First of all, I want to say that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to take part in this symposium. It is a very interesting and useful experience for me. Thinking about R2p and what I would like to talk about in this context, I decided that Russian-American relations, don't mind that this subject of my job, anyway. Russian-American relations can be described as one of the fundamental problems of this concept and different approaches in understanding of this idea. So, speaking about R2p, I want to mention two aspects. First of all, this concept was endorsed by all members of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and this is important regardless of the internal political system. So this means that R2p is not strictly connected to the liberal world order. Second, R2p is comparatively young and, as a consequence, underdeveloped idea. Undoubtedly, its most controversial part is the idea of the right of the interventional. This dispute about the right for intervention of international community and so on had begun even before the advent of the R2p itself. For example, we can remember humanitarian interventions in 1990s and even regime change approach of the beginning of the 21st century. But the question still remains unclear and not systematized when, how, and against whom to apply this rule, even in the event of serious humanitarian crisis. Since the use of force always works in someone's subjective interests, its use by the international community, only by international community, for the purpose of providing protection must be exclusively a collective decision. So, in this issue, Russian-American relations, in many respects, are shaping this problem of R2p implementation. We can mention crises from Yugoslavia to nowadays Syria that were used for some national interest and national purposes of both countries. And Syria, I think, can be seen as the highest point of this problem because both countries try to protect civilians, try to prevent the development of the conflict in Syria, but they struggle at the different sides of the barricades. So, what? This is the problem. Also depends on different approaches that were historically formed after the Soviet collapse, after the end of the Cold War. I want to describe them briefly. In the case of the United States, the situation is much simpler. Claiming for global leadership, the Washington establishment has seen the ways of its implementation in different ways, from the standpoint of economic integration, globalization, and the promotion of world development, or unilateral politics and peaceful threats approach. Hence, the variation of the name of the third paragraph of R2p, use of hard power, either humanitarian intervention involving relative legitimacy or unilateral actions in Bush Jr. style and neo-conservative approach. Although they appear to be a thing of the past. Anyway, here the United States have the opportunity to act from a strong position, and sometimes the United States do it. In turn, Russian action are caused in many respects by the reverse situation. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the country was on the verge of the further disintegration, collided with the strengthening of separatist forces. In addition, the countries with which Soviet Union and then young Russia after Soviet formed long-standing partnership, for example, Yugoslavia, became the object of humanitarian intervention and regime change. Not without the influence of this kind of events, a state-centric instead of human-centric security agenda was formed in Russia as a primary line of defense of the sovereignty. But together with that, Russia recognized the changes in international practice, as well as the need to discuss and address them. But it has been generally conservative towards the emerging norms and the renegotiation of established ones. It is noteworthy that Russia avoids calling R2p a new norm and prefers to call it a concept or a notion, emphasizing that R2p does not create new norms in international international law. But it is also true that in some cases Russia tends to avoid absolutist interpretations of sovereignty, and unlike the positions of R2p strongly hostile states such as Venezuela, and through an appropriately taken decision. However, the emphasis of sovereignty as responsibility at the domestic level can also be used as a strong argument against action by the international community. So, in these differences in Russian and American approaches that also caused by national interest and foreign policy problems of every country, there is a question: is R2p a stillborn conception or not? first, of course, the views regarding the transformation of the third pillar of R2p into an instrument of pursuing foreign policy are not groundless and have already come true. We've seen it many times after the end of the Cold War. However, one should not say that this concept is doomed to failure. Political crisis, as well as the difference in ruling regimes, is not the norm of all diversity. Is norm, sorry, of all diversity. The right of a nation to self-determination implies not only a rejection of the existing government of its institution, but also the non-interference of the alien parties in the process of seeking its own way of development. In this regard, R2p can be quite effective as a strategy for preventing and resolving conflicts through non-interference in domestic political problems. And in this context, I think that one of the main instruments of the implementation of R2p and making it neutral for Russia, for the United States and other parties, especially in the United Nations Security Council, can be using Security Council instruments and also United Nations troops and improving their possibilities. For example, sorry. I'm sorry. Of course, we can mention some problems. For example, United Nations Security Council doesn't solve a lot of problems briefly, or United Nations troops, peacekeeping troops, doesn't work perfect, and we've got a lot of examples. But anyway, it has a worldwide legitimacy, and it's endorsed by also Russia, United States, China, and other members of the United Nations Security Council. I want to remember that according to Article 47 of the United Nations Charter, the Military Staff Committee was established to help to work the United Nations Security Council. It consists of the chiefs of staff of the permanent members of the Security Council or their representatives. Any member of the organization not regularly represented on the committee can be invited for purposes if it's needed to resolve any situation. Military Staff Committee, being subordinate to the Security Council, is responsible for the strategic leadership of any armed forces placed at the disposal of the Security Council. So it means that can be used as a necessary instrument for taking common decision in R2p promotion. And I want to remember that this instrument never been used since it was established in 1946. So, thus I want to say that necessary minimum of tools required for R2p in the United Nations structure was created with the United Nations itself. And it can be used if we can political will for it, and it can be used if we can improve it, and if we can remember old instruments, for example, like the Military Staff Committee. For example, I can mention maybe Ukrainian crisis as a first step to try to use renewed United Nations peacekeeping force, for example, and deployment of peacekeeping forces in the eastern Ukraine and in Donbass could help to reduce casualties among civilians and could help to stop the conflict, for example. In addition, such a decision could give a significant ground for the development of R2p as a legitimate international tool. But just give us some information how to use R2p, because of course in Ukraine there is no casualties caused by government. That's it.
Thank you. There will now be time for conversation and questions amongst the panelists. Do you have any? If not, I can ask a question while you gather your thoughts. So Professor Packer, you were talking about this, but so there has been centuries of inaction while seeing the violence in Myanmar, and this is, not the only example of such things happening. What are some of the reasons why there has been a lack of action from international players, and do you foresee a change in this in the future?
So, first of all, I think the obvious answer why there is hesitancy or determined inaction is fundamentally the uncertainty of what that entails, and also the risk of reciprocity. In other words, look, there's a practical problem even under R2p, which is that you won't get a Security Council resolution adopted to support it. That's very clear. China at least will veto it, if not Russia and China together. And honestly, I'm not really sure about USA, France, or Britain, to be honest. I'm not sure what their positions are. So getting a Security Council endorsement of an intervention is a problem. So that problem of the Security Council has to be fixed, and that's a long discussion and it's been there for time. But I would say that it's an imperative. The second is, even if you had a Security Council that was willing, there is this concern about what this actually means. Who's going to put up the resources? And I mean, will Myanmar simply back down, reach some agreement to let some force come in? I mean, the discussion in a number of domains is one of my compatriots, Erwin Kotler, is calling for a protected repatriation to a protected homeland. Well, that means protection, that's some kind of force to kind of escort a repatriation. The Rohingyas can't, the ones who are right now in Cox's Bazar can't stay there. The monsoons are coming, the rains are going to come, there's going to be hundreds of thousands who are going to die. So something's going to have to happen here. Bangladesh doesn't want them coming interior of the country. That's going to be destabilizing. There's going to be all sorts of other precipitations. So the idea of protected return or repatriation is one thing, but then what? Into camps? We know where that goes. So protected homeland. That means a permanent force. That is a kind of peacekeeping or some kind of force. And frankly, I don't see who's stepping up to offer that. So we're really facing a conundrum now at the moment. And I think this is part of the crisis of confidence, because in that light, nobody believes in this anymore.
Do you want us to respond to that, or do you want
You can, or we can.
Okay, so we will now move on to the question and answer with the audience. There is an idle mic right over there. We ask those with questions to line up behind it. To keep the discussion flowing, to get in as many questions as possible, we ask each person to ask one question to one panelist. And please identify yourself. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Adar. I'm coming from Haifa University in Israel. Well, to frame my question, I would say that post-war Europe has committed the forced transfer of populations, millions of people were transferred, and it helped it to gain its current stability. And one can see that the current places of turbulence in Europe are places that that are more ethnically mixed, to give the latest example in Spain. And isn't it a possibility for other places in the world to gain their own stability and to reduce their amount of violence?
I'm kind of shocked by that question. Sorry, what's your evidence about the forced transfers helping to create stability? Which cases are you talking about? Which
one example could be the Volksdeutsch, ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, for example.
And everything's good now, including with the residue, and we never dealt with the Banach decrees and so forth. So my quick response on that, aside from, I would say there's an abundance of history that's completely contrary to that, Pakistan, India, and we can go on and on. Okay, but I have a very simple question for you. How do you propose to do it?
That's a very good question. One can see that the current situation is
So let's unpack the idea of let's get kind of the ethnic. That's an old nationalist paradigm, and it's a ruse. you know, if only the Germans could live in Germany and the Poles could live in Poland, you know, this is, which is, first of all, got a racist premise behind it, the ethno-national, the vote, and so forth. That's highly problematic. But it's also contrary to a host of contemporary international standards, not least human rights standards, self-identification, freedom of movement, what we're going to place them there and then keep them there. So I would just suggest to you that what the premise of your proposition is so not in the liberal world order. It's not even in kind of the realm of doability. I really go back to my question, how? Because the means that you would have to imagine, not only to do it, but to keep it, are anything but stabilizing, okay? So I think what we really have to talk about, you know, is how do we live together, notwithstanding the kind of challenges that are complicating life in terms of the mixture of aspirations, interests, and so forth. But the idea, I really wish that we can put that out of the discussion, this idea of separating or kind of, and I know it's a romantic idea. Many European countries right now are going down that path, and they have their associated, Romania for the Romanians, I mean, that we can go on and on about it. But that's really huge, more than problematic, a total disaster, in my humble.
Good afternoon, I'm Sarah from the National University of Singapore. My question is, given the rather pessimistic outlook of the international order, be it R2p or international norms in general, how can non-state actors step up, and what will their role be in the future?
Sure, I'll take this one. So, you know, I think, yes, you're right that there's a bit of a pessimism here on the kind of efficacy of international norms. But again, you know, as I said in my remarks, I think that's a little bit a feature of misplaced expectations, right? We can't expect the norms to do the work on their own. And the question that you ask, you know, what can non-state actors do, is an excellent one, because it is frequently non-state actors that do the work of promoting and strengthening these norms. So as I said, you know, we can't expect R2p to change states' interests overnight, but we can expect it to have impact at the margins. And the way that we strengthen that impact is through the action of non-state actors. So, you know, the kind of nitty-gritty answer there is, you know, to mobilize around these things. You know, we see, you know, in the case of the Rohingya, for instance, you know, we see non-state actors around the world mobilizing to draw attention to this crisis, to lobby their governments for action. Now, of course, down the road, we have the extremely complicated question of what would effective action look like. But, you know, notwithstanding that, you know, we can see a real impact of non-state actors, you know, on these questions of focusing attention on issues and making action a possibility.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mitchum Bergathon, and I'm from the Capitol Battalion down in Washington, D.C. My question is, the concept of human rights is relative to the unique morals and ethics of each individual actor. So how do you address the differences in these morals when trying to enforce a global uniform morality?
So I disagree with your premise. You know, that's like a philosophy discussion and so forth. In real international relations and international law, positive international law, this is not moral relativism. These are existing standards that have been negotiated, agreed by classical international law, the voluntary consent of the state. So disparate groups and so forth, that's part of the, you know, one of the features of the interesting discussion. Groups that have actually accepted the standard, negotiated the standard, adopted the standard, incorporated it in their own domestic law, and then they argue moral relativism. Well, hang on here. You know, that's not actually right. So I actually think the premise is maybe at a social level, but not in terms of real international relations at all. The problem is more a compliance or a respect question. In fact, I've never been to a state, and I've been to a lot of places working with a lot of governments, and even when they weren't parties to things. You know, when I first went to Burma, they were party to almost nothing except the UN Charter. They weren't party to Geneva Conventions, you know, and so forth and so on. But they never said, it's okay, we happily can torture, and we're going to kill civilians willy-nilly and so forth. They never said that. In fact, they were very proud that they were a state member of the United Nations in 1945 and 1948. They voted for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth. Notwithstanding, 1945, they were not a state. In 1948, upon their independence, they voted for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They were very proud of that. So I think we should keep our eye on the orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy is rooted in interests and reciprocity. And the problem here about reliability is what happens if states so easily do not respect their undertakings or obligations, on what do we then rely? But I don't think it's a moral relativist argument.
Thank you.
I don't know if maybe colleagues want to comment.
General questions?
Hi, my name is Andre Bhargav and I'm part of the EPIIC Colloquium. So my question relates to the future and extent of R2p. From my understanding, R2p is a very liberal concept which was constructed in the past decade. But with the renegotiation of the balance of power in today's world, how do we see it growing, and how do we see countries who embrace at times sovereignty over human rights accepting it, or do we see this dying out of R2p in the foreseeable future? And one of my fundamental criticisms of R2p is to what extent is it used? So, for example, in Libya, when R2p was used to save civilians in Benghazi, how did it go ahead to remove Gaddafi from power? So when do you stop, when do you draw the line, and what does that relate to the future of R2p? Thank you.
Maybe I try. So I think that this is what you say. This is the main problem of R2p, that it can be used in the national interest of the sovereign. It doesn't matter which one. For example, Libya was the first, I think, experiment in the history when this is important. Russia also didn't become an obstacle for using the R2p. Russian government decided that okay, let's see how it works maybe. And Gaddafi was the person who didn't have a great endorsement in the world community, so it could be used there. But then, after the operation started by NATO forces, Libya was destroyed totally, and Gaddafi was just killed. Okay, this was war, and not to matter. But anyway, Libya now doesn't exist as a state. So this is a problem of R2p, that when it's like a surgery, don't make things worse. But when you intervene, you have to take a responsibility, don't make things worse. So this is the main problem. And of course, it's my opinion, using only of United Nations Security Council resolution can be a real answer for any decisions in R2p concept.
A bit on that. So obviously the problem about R2p is who uses it to which ends. And we live in a world where we have a proposition of sovereign equality, but materially we don't, that's a fiction. So when Ronald Reagan's intervention in Grenada took place because he considered and declared unilaterally that there were concerns, it's just a matter of fact that Grenada could never do the inverse. So whatever we think about sovereign equality, that's a hard reality. So the only sense of R2p is within the context of a global world order, of a global rule of law, where the shared interest is that certain public goods, such as use of force, are under some kind of trusted control. And that's why I'm saying that the trust element here is gone. You know, for a liberal context, the idea is that there's a monopoly of force in that public entity, in this case, the United Nations Security Council. But actually, there isn't a monopoly of force. So that's another problem. There's all these other actors. So I think here, you know, and by the way, just about Gaddafi, you know, Gaddafi was a major Pan-Africanist and was highly regarded across the continent, supported many independence movements, and people who traveled in Africa, they would know this. And there was, you know, shock and great concern at the ease by which an oil-rich, you know, fairly developed little state could just be expunged like that. And if you don't think that North Korea was watching or others were watching, I mean, that's partly where we are now. So I just go back to the public order, public good element here. And the crisis is that nobody believes in it. So that's a general problem.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm from the Brazilian delegation. And my question is not directed at any speaker in particular, so please feel all free to answer. My question is related to, especially considering the obligations, the responsibility to prevent, and the responsibility to rebuild, and the current factors that are happening right now with climate change and environmental disasters. Where do you think if it will be possible to have an expansion of the concept of responsibility to protect to natural disasters in countries which are unable or unwilling to provide their populations with basic human rights in those particular cases?
So, you know, one of the features of responsibility to protect is, you know, we always talk about the intervention against the will of the territorial state, right? But that's not kind of the main hook, right? It's that the state has sovereignty and the obligation to protect its people, and when it is unable to do so, you know, international actors should step in with its permission or can go to the Security Council to do so without. So I think that first piece, that, you know, there's this idea that it's incumbent upon all of us to, you know, protect people whose states can't protect them, kind of offers a hook where you know, something like the effects of climate change could, you know, be brought in there, because this is not necessarily, the harms that occur as a result of climate change are not necessarily the result of bad acts on the part of the state, but they may be something that the state can't remediate on its own. So I think, you know, obviously when we're talking about responsibility to protect, we're talking about atrocity crimes, but it's not philosophically inconsistent with expansion to other types of harms.
Thank you to that. So that's a great question, and it links with like last night's panel on migration and so forth. So what we're really talking about is that we live in a complex interdependent world. All sorts of great elements. Migration's historical fact, it's not going to disappear. These kind of problems and the speed by which they affect or connect us has ramped up. Now, what we're also finding out is that the Westphalian paradigm is a little bit of a fiction too. It probably was at its origin, but now it's being laid bare. There are increasing number of states. You know, Madeleine Albright had her paradigm of failed, failing, rogue, and I can't remember, was that it? Something else. You know, that was her paradigm. But actually what she was identifying is that the concept of the state presumes what we call effective control, and there's some kind of willingness. What we're finding is that more and more states, it's not that they're unwilling, they are literally unable. And small states subjected, or even large states, Bangladesh, to effects of climate change, are not in control and not going to be in control. And from a responsibility to protect paradigm, the persons who are subject to this individual human beings, the human-centric approach to security, they are vulnerable. And it's not by the will of anyone, it's the collective effect. But what they're going to do about it, they're not going to sit and drown, they're going to move. Or someone's going to have to help them. In some states, low-lying states, Maldives, they say, is going to disappear in next period of time. And somebody's going to have to do something. So what I would say here is that we actually have to have a deeper conversation about this complex interdependence in terms of where is the locus of governance that's going to take responsibility, not just the state. And to me, it's not just the residual of the P5 for an authorization intervention. It is this kind of robust prevention side and reconstruction, especially the prevention side. There's lots that can be done, lots of efforts that should be mobilized now and should have been done in other cases. So I think the logical deduction of your question goes very far and is a fruitful avenue to pursue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm a Kabbalah at Obama. I'm a local high school student. And it's my question.
Thank you, great.
So my question is primarily directed to Professor Packel. You've spoken about how they're all, as it stands, the R2p is broken in some ways. They're all scholarly arguments that there are inherent problems based on where nationals talking to you with intervention. So the question is, as it stands, is there a solution? Is an alternative to R2p that works in the current, national order of UN, and is this cheaper for this generation?
So, first of all, where do you go to high school?
I'm from schools.
Wow. Okay. So for people who live outside of America, forgive me this remark, but it's very encouraging to hear people like you speak, because actually the solutions are going to come from the next generation. You see, I don't just think R2p is broken. What we're now seeing is that multilateralism is in trouble. We're actually seeing the United Nations discredited as such. So a return to kind of self-help efforts at all levels, and particularly in a world that is less and less state-centric, which means more dangerous in all ways. I'm not against the state, I'm in favor of the state. I want the state to provide security, to deliver all sorts of public goods to me and so forth, to provide that stability in which I can invest and plan and carry out my future for my family and so forth. And I believe that's a universal shared experience and desire. So we're in this kind of very dangerous time. And we have to rethink, what I would say, this is just a personal opinion, but at the end of the First World War, we can go back in historical moments of disjuncture, whether it was the Congress of Vienna, the League of Nations, the San Francisco Conference, and so forth. We didn't really have that at the end of the Cold War. There was no kind of there was New World Order, President Bush Sr., there was the Paris Charter for New Europe, overcoming of the East-West split and so forth. But we're kind of lost now, and we're living in what I call a zero-polar world, not a multi-world, a zero-polar. It's just through it, and all sorts of increasingly influential non-state actors and so forth. So we have to rethink this totally. And I think it is for the next generation. I don't have a solution for it. What I would say is if we don't solve the problem of institutional arrangements to address public interests and goods on a universal level, we're in deep, deep trouble. We are not too many steps away from annihilation. And that may sound very pessimistic, but there were really serious discussions. It's not a joke when the guys in Chicago put the nuclear clock, another minute closer. This is not a joke. I have a sister who lives in Seoul, Korea. She went last year. She's a biochemical engineer. She went to work for Samsung there. She was not thinking that she's living where she's living now. And I can tell you she's reflecting.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Shaleb and I'm from the Israeli delegation. And my question is addressed to you, Dr. Cronin-Furman. You mentioned that, and I really agreed with you, that the situation is bad, that we have to do something, and that R2p is not the solution. And you also comment that it's like a feature of the system. I mean, the genocides are outcome of a feature system and not a bug. I want to ask you, in your opinion, is there a practical solution? Putting it in other words, if I would make you like the most powerful and influential man in the world, let's say maybe the president of the United States, tomorrow, what would be your action? Okay. In theory, what would be your action to heal the fundamental problems in the system?
In the system, or are you asking me about the current crisis?
The system.
So, I mean, the gist of my remarks is that basically the system works this way because this is how powerful actors want the system to work, right? Professor Packer is making the point that the state system is becoming increasingly obsolete. I think, for me, the one thing I would do if I had ultimate political power would be to open borders. Not necessarily, going to solve all the problems without creating new ones, but I think that would be my play. With regard to dealing with current crises, I'm not convinced that more military intervention is necessarily a good thing. The Rohingya crisis is one that kind of challenges that presumption because this is human suffering on a scale that is just astronomical. But it's hard to see what intervening would do. It's hard to see what at this point any good outcome would be, right? You know, if they go back, then they have to be protected there, and that's going to be against the will of the Burmese government and require military force. If they don't go back, 1 million people live out their lives in refugee camps. You know, these are the same problems that confront us in other cases of mass atrocities. So, you know, I think, you know, when people ask me, what can I do, what should be done right now, I think the answer is, you know, we have to support the places that are hosting them. So, you know, on this crisis, money and aid has to go to Bangladesh to support housing the Rohingya, but also to the host population to avoid conflict between the guests and the hosts. And, you know, that's basically my answer. And most places where mass atrocities are occurring, it's hard to think about how military force can be deployed to solve the problem, but there is a way that money can be deployed to at least ameliorate the problem.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
That's a great question.
Can I just add that in response? So first of all, I don't, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying R2p is, or the state are obsolete. I'm actually making a different argument, which is that, first of all, R2p as such, I would suggest needs to be rethought and in context and reinvigorated, particularly on the prevention side. But that requires a rethinking of the total structures. And I am in favor of the state. I mean, if you're not, you're kind of an anarchist, and you know, good luck to you. I'm not in favor of open borders yet. I'm also a European citizen, incidentally, and I'm quite concerned by borders now coming up. You know, ultimately, yes, what I would like is to be able to have movement with confidence and without fear. And so this actually, from a governance perspective, means some kind of a regulatory framework. This is what Jonathan Prentice was arguing last night in the new global compact on migration is about. So within that context, we do have to acknowledge that the relative position of the state, and many states in particular, is diminished in relative terms. There are other actors. I mean, it's not a new thing to say that Bill Gates alone is worth more than the GDP of something like 52 or 54 African states on an annual basis. I mean, that's just a crazy kind of percentage. But it just tells you private actors are really influential. And it's not new, by the way, the East Indian Company and so forth. But right now, today, this is particularly so when a number of states are quite weak. And I'm not in favor, and this may sound paradoxical, because the problem we're seeing in a number of states is the reaction to that is the state be asserting its authority to be even stronger. So we have now what some German scholars are calling orderism, where Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Philippines, a number of states are asserting the security apparatus of the state to provide that confidence and governance in the sense of security of the population, but at the cost of human rights, minority rights, and so forth, saying we can't afford them and so forth. That, to me, from a historical perspective and contemporarily, is a recipe for disaster. So, and it's totally not the liberal world order. So, just for you to understand the nuance, I'm not against the state. I'm actually in favor of a robust state, but one that is of a character that is effective in regulating on an international system the really existing complex interdependence we share.
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Layla Dashing Lee and I'm a third year student at Tufts. I'm part of the EPIIC colloquium, and thank you all for coming out today, and I especially like Dr. Cronin-Furman's pragmatic view of R2p, so this question is directed at you, but also open to other panelists. In terms of, when I think of R2p, there's a mismatch between ideals and reality. Are there precedents or like elements of successful experience we could extract from history? For example, the NATO bombing in Kosovo before the R2p Convention, and after that it's the Libya decision where also NATO led the operation. And that, in the case of Libya, even Russia and China
consented to the Security Council decision, whereas in retrospect, there are a lot of unlawful and the expansion of mandate are the problem, but is there any value extracting the successful elements of these historical examples and at least to say to political actors that this can be done?
Sure. So certainly, we have examples where intervention has been deployed to save lives, right? We've seen this in terms of unilateral action. Vietnam went into Cambodia, Tanzania went into Uganda. These are arguably illegal uses of force at the time, and were undertaken for myriad reasons, many of which were self-interested, but did stop human suffering. As you say, we also have, the Kosovo example on the international stage. We have the end of World War II, for that matter. I think, there's a distinction between asking ourselves what kind of general precedent is useful and what specifics are useful. So there are things we know about what works in terms of mitigating, if not stopping, atrocities. We know that under certain circumstances, even-handed intervention versus perpetrator kind of targeting intervention works. We know that in some contexts, safe zones can be useful, but we know that in others, they're definitely not safe. So, we have evidence about how to do some of these things. And, that forms kind of a useful body of data from which to think about, how to do it going forward. But I think the question you're asking is more on the normative level. What precedents do we have that we can point to say, yes, this shows that this was the right thing to do. This is, the way we ought to justify it in the future. And there, I'm a little less comfortable. We had this question earlier about Libya as precedent, and obviously, what's happened in Libya is tremendously discouraging. I also think that what happened in Libya is not really a very strongly negative or strongly positive precedent for R2p, right? Because what actually was the work that R2p was doing there? It wasn't a hard case. It was easy to get authorization for intervention. But I think, unfortunately, from my perspective, the answer to your question is no, we do not have a great precedent of the way to do this in a way that doesn't make me really concerned about using it again. But that said, we do have plenty of instances where we know on the microdynamics, something that has worked.
Thank you. I also would like to stay optimistic and pragmatic because international law is still in the making.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmeline. I'm from the Singapore delegation. My question is directed towards Professor Peckel. So my question is, what can small states do given such crises that involve the migration of people? So the specific stance of Singapore is that we will not take in any refugees from the Rohingya crisis, but we have been providing financial aid as well as advice to the, or we have suggestions to provide advice to the Myanmar government on how to resolve these ethnic disparities and ethnic conflicts. But is there anything else that we should be doing to show that we're actually playing a role and not just providing an advisory role but not bearing the brunt of the conflict?
Well, great question. First of all, small states can do enormous amount, and they are actually particularly well suited. I suggest you might want to read a small book some years ago written by Jan Egeland, a former Minister of Development Cooperation. I can't remember if he's a former minister of Norway, and after the UN. I can't remember what he's doing right now, but he was actually for a time, by the way, the UN Under Secretary General for Prevention of Conflicts. And he wrote a small book specifically about the comparative advantages of small states in multilateralism. Of course, Norway has played an outsized role in that, but so has Singapore, and I know that from ASEAN and elsewhere. So you already mentioned some things that can be done. Let me just point out that in the context of what we're talking about, small states are particularly interesting because they're not threatening. The idea of Singapore actually intervening in Indonesia is, pretty silly. It's not going to happen. So, Singapore doesn't present a threat. Singapore can have, even from a force perspective, and I know this is also true, can have specially trained forces that may have particularly targeted, and that's another thing about the phenomena of contemporary international relations. The security threats are such that sometimes very pinpoint interventions can have a particular effect. So I don't even rule out Singapore from a security or an intelligence, and Singapore I know plays also doing intelligence. But more importantly, I would say, is the diplomacy and the assistance, technical cooperation assistance role, and particularly in the context of prevention. What can we do better? Prevention works. We know it works from, why do we have a fire engine that we're paying for down the hall, down the street? Because we know we might need it. Why do we buy insurance, and we do all sorts of things because we know they work, preventive health and so forth, and definitely in security. So from a diplomacy perspective, and I would argue in the context of ASEAN or even the ASEAN Regional Forum, Singapore has a lot. I mean, there are specific mechanisms that Singapore could be activated. Singapore also can mobilize its wealth, its resources economically. Singapore was one of the main investors in Myanmar, probably still is, particularly banking, telecommunications, hotels, I think, and other things. So, Singapore is in a position to exercise an influence in an interesting way. And now, last but not least, the intellectual capacity. Tell you a small example. Some people might remember there was a wonderful ambassador from a little state called Cape Verde that managed to get on the UN Security Council, a guy named Ambassador Jesus, back in the early 1990s. I don't think that he remembers him. And just by his personality and his intellect, he played an incredible role, and he twice, based on the circulation of the Security Council presidencies, he twice was president. So 2 months this guy spent as president of the Security Council. Very important and influential. So small ain't bad at all. And I would commend Singapore to really think about how you can exercise your influence.
Thank you.
My name is Uzair, and I'm a student from Pakistan and also a member of the EPIIC Colloquium. My question isn't directed to any of you and concerns the legal basis of R2p. And with my understanding of R2p now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not a legal thing. It's more of a norm that countries have agreed to implement under certain circumstances. And with that, commentators on one side have argued for a push to make it a legal norm, saying that it'll be easier to sort of call out the double standards that R2p has in its implementation, but other people have said that by making it a legal norm, it's more difficult to implement in complex situations like case studies we've talked about today. So with that being said, would you think it's wise for it to be pushed as the legal norm in the future?
So this is a little bit why I left the practice of international law and became a political scientist. I mean, the international system is anarchic, right? There's no ultimate enforcer of international law. And what that means is that, international law exists and it has impact, but it doesn't play the role that law in a domestic system with reliable enforcement does. And for me, what that means is that this isn't a terribly critical question to answer. I don't actually think R2p adds much to the body of international norms and law, and I think Professor Packer made this point earlier, that for a lot of us, it just looks like it basically records and consolidates things that already existed. So, the Genocide Convention has been in place since 1948 and ostensibly imposes an obligation to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. We have UN documents and agreements that impose the same obligation on crimes against humanity. So R2p is not a groundbreaking innovation so far as norms and laws that were in place are concerned. So it's not clear to me what real effect formalizing it in a convention or something similar would do, because states feel comfortable disregarding law just as much as they feel comfortable disregarding norms. And they also, feel comfortable using norms and interpreting them in ways that are convenient for them as they do with law.
So I got to say a few things on this. First of all, we should, a general matter, we should not conflate, and it's often done, what's relatively called domestic or municipal law with international law. These are different systems of law, but they are both systems of law. And international law functions not in a vertical or hierarchical structure, but is horizontal. And it heavily depends upon reciprocity and the unilateral actions of the subjects of the law to respect it. But by the way, let me just say that that doesn't make international law less effective than domestic law in many states. I don't know where you've ever traveled, but there are some parts of this world where it's there's not a robust rule of law in some parts of the world. In that respect, a lot of international law works extremely effectively. The gentleman behind you and myself are here right now because international law works. Not only traveling, but passports, all sorts of things. We're wearing clothes from different parts of the world. I don't even know where the young people in the American military, where all the brass and where all of the cloth comes from, but I'm going to make a wild guess that some of it comes from other countries. There's all sorts of law that's functioning. Now, the issue about R2p, I've already said, in my view, it didn't add anything to orthodox positive international law, but politically it was extremely significant for those subject to the law to come together, the authorities, and say, we accept to really follow this is quite a significant statement. And now the question is, do they comport does their behavior follow the declaration? Would it help to legalize some elements of R2p? It might, and the kind of things that have been mooted are the idea of suspending the veto with regard to the P5 if a matter comes of an R2p nature that might intersect with their interests. That would be remarkable, but you're going to have to change the charter, basically, which has been done, but it is problematical. I would say that, and then I would soberly say the chances of achieving that right now are nil. And in fact, I think it was already the case in 2005 that the P5 basically rejected this idea, but I would say less likely to accept it today. But I don't think that's a reason to say we give up on it. I think we need to change things, and the composition, the nature of the Security Council, or the control of security and use of force internationally, is a major question that we have to deal with. I hope I wasn't wrong. Was I wrong on that?
Well, I feel compelled to say a few words in, first of all, fabulous panel. Thank you so much. And you've been up there a long time, so I'll keep this very short. But each of you brought something to this discussion which I think was really, really valuable, and I thank you for that. But I want to address this issue of optimism, pessimism. I think we should be optimistic about this. I mean, a mere 13 years ago, every nation in the world agreed with a political declaration that they shared a responsibility to prevent people from mass atrocity. That's a very significant event. Look what's going on out there today. And we probably couldn't get that done today. Things have deteriorated since 2005. But that was a major breakthrough. They put an asterisk against the word sovereignty for the first time since the Westphalian deal was made on sovereign states. And that asterisk, when you look at the bottom of the page, says, yes, except that if you're unable or unwilling to protect your population from mass atrocity, step aside, because we're coming in, if necessary. As to optimism, may I invite you to put this in a different perspective. Remember that it was 1948 when the nations of the world adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it took 50 years before that norm, political declaration, political commitment, actually translated into domestic legislation, to institutional expression, to the creation of a Human Rights Commission, now a Human Rights Council, to rapporteurs, to consequences for people. In other words, it takes a long time to move this crazy world from one state of being to another. A first step was taken in 2005. The process is continuing with errors like Libya, with mistakes, with bad implementation, but moving in a direction. And it seems to me the job of the people in this room is to be advocates for continuing that evolution, find creative ways of advancing it. You know, the Brazilian delegation to the United Nations, after Libya, proposed something called a responsibility while preventing, which was a gloss on the doctrine which said, if you are authorized to take steps, then you must report to the Council regularly, your conduct must be monitored, you must stay strictly within the ambit. In other words, they addressed the excesses and the abuses of Libya. So 13 years later, it's not taken off the shelf and used as it should be in Myanmar or Yemen or Syria. But the important thing is that we started going in a direction. And let's acknowledge our shared responsibility to keep pushing in that direction. The Security Council in its present manifestation cannot continue. It just can't. It's without legitimacy. The day will come when the veto will fall away, John, when the composition will be changed so it is representative and legitimate. Let's push toward that day, and let's make sure we have an instrument that's capable of responding on behalf of humanity using this principle that's now been accepted. And that leads me to a question, if I may, very quickly. There are those who are saying that 2005 was a grand bargain. Kosovo in 1998 was self-help, all right? It was illegal, but it was legitimate, said the International Commission. We're not going to stand by and let people murder others in mass numbers, whether it, law be damned, okay? 2005, there was a bargain. Okay, we'll give up the right of self-help if you, Security Council, will take on the job of implementing this principle in the appropriate case. We tried to persuade them to give up the veto, they said no. The Security Council has now failed in that responsibility. It's almost like a fundamental breach case for a lawyer in a contract, you know? Some are suggesting, in the face of the Security Council's fundamental breach of that bargain of 2005, the deal's over and we can go back to self-help, coalitions of the willing. What is your view of tearing up the document from 2005, saying, okay, if that's the way it is, Russia and China, we'll do it ourselves, and have coalitions of the willing start worrying about how to rescue the Muslims in Myanmar, the victims in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere? I know this is not consistent with the rule of law, but it might be consistent with the requirements of humanity.
So this is interesting. I actually hadn't heard this argument that the Security Council has failed in its obligations, so we have to kind of update to something new. I guess my response to that is, you know, how willing is anyone? You know, your initial remarks really resonated for me, right? That, you know, we started talking about an international criminal court in the 1940s, and it took 60 years before the thing was in place. That, you know, the UDHR took 30 years to become operationalized in the ICCPR. So I think, you know, had you made this point before November of 2016, I might have felt very encouraged by it, right? That, you know, we need to have the systems in place, and when the politics align, then we can push them forward, we can use them. But, you know, the US government's turn away from the Human Rights Project over the last year and a half, and what appears to me to be the very real emboldening of repressive states as a consequence of that, really makes me concerned about this idea of relying on coalitions of the willing there, if, you know, indeed we believe that, you know, we want intervention into these situations. You know, looking at the Rohingya crisis, the US is not willing. The actors that have been quite vocal on the crisis are Muslim states. You know, we've heard quite a lot from Turkey, from Pakistan, but neither of those states are going to be willing to countenance an intervention over the will of the territorial state because of the things they have happening in their own borders. So for me, this raises a lot of questions and concerns.
Please, I wanted to ask if you...
I want to say that Commissioner William has a big problem. It doesn't have a system of check and balances. It's maybe military union, maybe some group of countries, but there is no balance. There is no other side with other opinion. It's important, I think, for this kind of work.
I just want to say that, you know, the whole deal in the UN Charter of the P5 was that the P5 would be the guarantors of the international peace and security, ultimately. And actually, my understanding was that the original vision was that they would principally contribute the peacekeepers and all these other ideas. Well, it wasn't specifically peacekeepers, but the idea. And as you know, the Orthodoxy and they would actually not contribute. And now this is all changing with China and so forth. But I think what's really happened is that the idea that a public interest, a trust for public interest, was conveyed, entrusted to the P5, has now been laid bare that they're not actually performing that public trust function. And worse than that, they are using their position for the self-interest. That's a massive issue for the whole world order. And that's what, and I believe, you know, from the perspective of law and political science, by the way, that that's not going to be sustainable. Something's going to give here. My concern is, living in this world, that I am now less secure because there are many, many actors out there, governmental and non-governmental, who are going to draw the conclusion that's not a reliable system. And we're going to act on our own in different ways. My concern about the Rohingyas, you should know, are, first of all, not all Muslims, incidentally. They are preponderantly Muslim. But they're a modest, even to the extent they're Muslim. By the way, they're not the largest number of Muslims in Myanmar. That's another fact. But they're a modest Sunni group who have never demanded external self-determination, not even a specific autonomy regime. More recently they did, but historically not. They simply wanted to be integrated, normal members of Burmese society, members of the Rohingya leadership who were part of the leadership in Burma after 48, members of parliament and so forth. So this is not a radical group is what I want to say. Watch what's going to happen. They're going to become radical because there are no options, there are no choices. And there are those who want to radicalize them, and that's going to happen. So this doesn't make me more secure, and I think, I hope that the changes will come. It is partly incumbent on people sitting here, both in Russia, in the United States of America, and countries of the P5, to persuade your governments that it's in your interest and a public interest internationally to be prepared to change this, because it has to change. Otherwise, I'm afraid the whole United Nations, which is now increasingly discredited, we're going to be in deep trouble.
Hi, my name is Kai. I'm part of the EPIIC colloquium. My question is actually directed specifically to Mr. Kislitsyn. So the responsibility to protect doctrine. We talked about this before, but often the most sort of talked about aspect of R2p is the intervention phase, because that's sort of that's the sexiest part of R2p. But we know that prevention is also a very integral part to R2p. There is a long list of things to do before we actually even start thinking about any form of intervention. So in regards to prevention and preventative peace building, it strikes me as necessary, as fundamentally necessary, that states, and particularly big states, and particularly states on the Security Council, and particularly the P5, are going to need to cooperate. I definitely appreciate Professor Packer's comment about small states being able to have large effects in the long run, but especially in the short run, cooperation and prevention is really dependent on swift cooperation by big states. Based on the fact that there has been such an erosion of trust between the P5 and bigger states in general. Maybe we can say that this is kind of the return of geopolitics, as has kind of been quoted in several outlets. How can we work towards cooperation when, fundamentally speaking, there is such a deep mistrust amidst this return of geopolitics?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I want to say that this mistrust in P5 was happened before. We can remember times of Caribbean crisis, for example. So this is just conjuncture, and the waves of trust grows and slow down. So about preventing of conflicts, I want to say that if we say about the conflict in the country, doesn't matter which one, how we can prevent its internal political process. For example, maybe I'm cynic, but civil war is also a political process and also is a part of historical development of the country. So prevent civilian casualties, mass atrocities, of course, it is important. But how you prevent the conflict between two political powers, between maybe Gaddafi and opposition, to some extent, is, I think, very difficult and just impossible. And it also can make things worse, because if you try to prevent, you can connect to one side, solve this conflict, and then you will as something it's like an interventionist, even without military power. So prevention, helping not to make mass atrocities, of course it is important, but to prevent conflict in the sovereign country from other sides, I think it's very difficult. I'm not even ready to analyze it.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Samuel from the Russian delegate. Just to follow up on this question, I would like to get an enlightenment on the causes of intervention in terms of deniable causes of intervention and undeniable causes of intervention. I take the example of the Crimea annexation, and my suggestion would be in our attempt to protect, is it possible for the R2p to be conceptualized or designed in such a way that it can actually investigate the causes of intervention in different countries? For example, there's been a lot of documents about why Russia went ahead to annex Crimea. And some people said it was because they wanted to protect Russian citizens, it was because there was a threat to Russian forces. Some other people said it was to further strengthen Russia's domestic and international legitimacy. These are very different causes of intervention. But the question now is, how is the R2p designed to investigate causes of intervention? Because if we have a light on that, maybe it could help us find a way to protect in other cases.
So, if I understand you right, your question is about, for example, Crimea, how it happened in using of this R2p approach, right?
Yeah. You know, there was certain different opinions on school of thoughts to why Russia went ahead to do what it did in Crimea. So the question is more like an enlightenment to know if the R2p is designed to investigate causes of intervention. Why did the West go into Kosovo? Why did Russia go into Crimea? It's just very basic.
Investigation of intervention in R2p context. Anyway, it could be interesting, but I'm not sure that EPIIC or other big countries would approve such approach to investigate the things that already has happened. I think this is a matter of history and work for history, I suppose.
So let me say, respond in a somewhat different way. So one of the problems with contemporary international law and the structures of international law is that even where we have norms established about what should be done in a particular case, we're lacking the mechanisms for independent and partial determination of, for example, whether the criteria have been met that would merit the application of the norm. For example, self-determination, well-established norm, going back before the United Nations, but certainly within the United Nations, but there's no place to bring a self-determination claim. It doesn't exist. So this means that we're left in the realm of politics, which is driven by interests, and therefore the invocation, you're using the word cause, I believe. I don't know what cause in a objective sense would be, but if you're asking for what are the justifications of the invoked rationale, what the problem is, we don't have an independent body that would assess that. That could say, for example, that R2p applies in the Rohingya case. So arguments are constructed. Shireen Abadi and the Nobel Women's Tawakkol Karman and others are declaring it because we don't have a body. Theoretically, the Security Council should respond to acts of threats to international peace and security. Is the exodus of 700,000, 695,000 now Rohingyas a threat? Prima facie, you would say, well, that's a significant population across the border. Probably it's a threat. But the Security Council, yes, they've taken cognizance of it. They've had some discussions, but they haven't acted in this way. So we have a structural problem with this. I would also venture to say that in attributing, we have to rethink not only therefore the norm, but we have to rethink how we create the bodies for global rule of law. And right now we have this odd situation that the Security Council, according to the Charter, is both a political and a legal entity simultaneously. And that's problematical. There's no independent justice in that regard. By the way, last thing just about prevention. The Charter, if you read the Charter, Article 33 on Pacific settlement of disputes obliges states to exhaust the, I forget how many are indicated. I think there's 8 specific means of Pacific settlement dispute. That comes before Chapter 7. So the prevention argument of R2p is not just an asserted thing by some, it's again a kind of articulation of existing international law. There is a hard obligation under Article 33, but we never seem to do it. We don't exhaust it. And that would help us get it way upstream, to use the language of Ed Luck, way upstream in the responsibility to protect before we get to the hard questions.
Hello, Lisa. I'm a student at Trinity College Dublin. And first of all, I want to thank you for your honesty. Also, I talked to a friend last week, and he's working for the French embassy in Bangladesh, and he told me that he just went to the deportation camps to see where the funding goes, and he said, look, Lisa, I'm honest with you. It doesn't look good. They're mostly pregnant women and children. We're facing rainfalls and storms very soon. I don't have words for that. And it instantly reminded me during our time working for our embassies in Canberra when we were facing refugee crisis in Manus Island, in Nauru, and all Papua New Guinea. And I was at the point, and that might be relevant for anyone here that is looking for a career in diplomacy and mediation, that you might be at this point and ask your question, why are we doing this? Can we actually do something about it? I mean, for myself, out of that frustration, I decided to go to peace studies and take that responsibility, not only because I'm privileged enough to do it, but not doing something is also not a solution. And I was wondering, what is your motivation to do this, and what would you recommend young people that are striving towards such a career?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, I really empathize with what you're saying. For me, the reason I went to pursue the political science PhD is that I worked in transitional justice, and I often found myself in rooms where international lawyers were talking about the grand expectations that, rule of law would trickle down from a tribunal into a domestic system, that it would promote respect for human rights. And really, I found myself wondering what the evidence was for that. And it turned out that, while obviously these things sounded wonderful and we want them all to be true, there wasn't much. And so, I pursued my PhD to kind of gain the skills and expertise necessary to look at those questions and find out, what might work and what might not. So for me, my advice is very much coming out of my own experience, which is to, get as much information as you can, challenge received wisdom. And frankly, I know this is an unpopular position, but for me, sometimes doing something is not better than doing nothing. And I firmly believe that, especially those of us working kind of in international development and international human rights, we should get comfortable with the idea that sometimes we are going to have to do nothing.
I can't imagine doing nothing. But I take your point. I know the kind of cases where, I know what you're talking about. First of all, thanks for the question. I'm impressed with the people who are here, because I'm guessing that you're here because you've actually made a determined choice, most of you, not to be, working on Wall Street. Professor Rock and I teach law students up in Ottawa, and there's a number of them. That's what they would dream to do, by the way. People can choose different things. I never had that motivation, but I think if you look at the world and you feel something about the world, then it's hard to sit. And I think people are moved by, and there's the old CNN effect, right? Old now, it wasn't old 25 years ago, it was new. But when people are confronted by the shocking nature of our species, of man's inhumanity to man, that's a phrase, but the reality of it is breathtaking. We can cause harm, and now we can annihilate our species. That's quite remarkable. And so if you are moved at all, whether, in my case, my parents were immigrants to Canada, came after the Second World War, they both were fought in the Second World War, were different armed forces, actually came from India to Canada, and they felt they had a just war, actually. But they were deeply concerned by what happened and the effects of it. And my father, who was a career British Army, from a boy soldier, joined the British Army before he was 14 years of age. But he never felt comfortable by the fact that there's a statue on the Mall in London to a guy known as Balmer Harris, who invented terror bomb. Has it been taken down? I'm very glad to hear that. But it was there for quite a long time. I guess it must have been taken down fairly recently. But that's disconcerting, because for a career soldier who believed in things like chivalry and decency and so forth, there were very, very troubling aspects of that. And so issues of justice and so forth, and how to construct a world that would not face subsequent generations. The first line of the Charter of the United Nations is about the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetimes. That was a real statement for the really existing population of the world at the time it really happened. So I think we look now, I think we have to ask, what can we do? Because there are perilous times and there are risks. And these things are very much interconnected. To say that the Rohingya are far off people in a distant land, just isn't true anymore. That's going to come back to roost. So what to do? I'm really impressed. You're doing what needs to be done. And it's within it is actually within your capacity to shape a different world.
Thank you again for your honesty.
Absolutely.
This is a very enlightening panel. Thanks very much for your suggestions and the discussion. I think that sometimes we forget about the work of the International Law Commission in developing the definitions of those 4 core crimes and the importance that made to advancing us to the point where we could actually have an R2p. And the second thing I wanted to say was that We spend so much time on the intervention portion of R2p that we forget prevention and rebuilding. And I wonder if you can think of cases of successful prevention applied through R2p, by R2p, since 2005.
I mean, it's so hard to find the dogs that didn't bark, right? You know, we've had kind of discussions of R2p being applied retroactively in the case of Kenya, with the idea that you know, the fact that the violence didn't escalate, didn't continue, was the result of international action, and that action was motivated by the responsibility to protect. Obviously, we don't actually know that either of those two pieces of the story are true, but that is the one that jumps to mind in response to your question.
I think that's the only one that jumps to my mind as well.
Yeah. So I'm interested to hear if others can think of other cases.
What I have to say about mechanisms, so R2p formally in the outcome document was September 2005. At that point, first of all, Professor Johnson, you could probably remind me, when was the Department of Political Affairs established? Early 90s, under Butcher Skelly, I think, was it with yeah, exactly. So, and within the Department of Political Affairs, what I was going to tell you is that the mediation support unit and the division of peace, what is it called, PMD, Peace and Mediation Division, was not established until 2008, I think 2007, 2008. After, and at that time, Undersecretary General Lynn Pascoe had gone, you know, this is the minutiae of the UN, but had gone to get posts to the ACPQ and the Fifth Committee, thank you. And he requested 99 posts to build up the capacity to actually do this. And he got approval for 2. And so, you know, the states basically did not respond. And then, with the goodwill of a number of states, Norway amongst others, they said, okay, how can we do this? This was the basis of the creation of what's called the standby team of mediation experts. Now I think it's 8 independent experts hired by extra budgetary resources. It's piecemeal. It's half-assed. It's not serious. And that's why there aren't so many engagements. Now, that's directly linking R2p to specific action. But actually the concept of early preventive action has a pedigree elsewhere. And in the OSCE, for example, I worked for many years on this, and I would just commend to look at the work that was done. There were many cases, Macedonia in 1999, where 300 people died, where you can look at Moldova. There's a number of cases where things were very tense and things could have gone the wrong way. But there were already developed engagements, mechanisms, concerted diplomacy, and so forth. And constructing institutions, treaties, the whole post-Cold War bilateral treaties, not just the multilateral treaties, the historic reconciliation between Romania and Hungary, and so forth and so on. We'd go on. That's all the construction. To me, that is responsibility to prevent. It was the duty of the states to engage in a good faith and energetic way to pursue that. We had a mechanism in the context of the OSCE to lead that. We don't have those mechanisms elsewhere. And you know, only the genocide prevention one, and that's very thin too.
Also,
sorry, go ahead.
I want to add one thing, maybe controversial. As a history of success in R2p, I want to mention Crimea. What I mean, there were about 40,000 Russian troops and about 60,000 Ukrainian troops in the beginning of the crisis. We also know that there are mainly Russian population with Ukrainian part, about maybe 10% of the population. So mass atrocities could appear in Crimea, but there were even no one civil or military death caused by this problem. So this is, I think, a good example of R2p as a success story.
I'm not convinced by that one, but I do want to say that, you know, there are other parts of the UN system where mechanisms are actually put in place to strengthen prevention and particularly rebuilding efforts. So that could be part of R2p. We don't make a connection to them very often. For example, security sector reform or integrated DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. I mean, these are already existing mechanisms that are put in place that could actually be tied in, but we don't hear a lot of conversations about how those are applied in the context of R2p. It's almost like these are separate things happening, and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing most of the time.
So the sad thing is that there's been in the last 20 years an enormous amount of progress on this. And if you look at the way the United Nations, which was dysfunctional in many ways, I mean, don't forget, before the end of the Cold War, the UN was not asked to be very operational except for certain entities like refugees or World Food Program and so forth. But the UN was essentially a talk shop. And it was only after the Cold War that there was an expectation and the possibility that the UN could start to do certain things. And also the increase in the capacities of regional and sub-regional organizations similarly. And there's been amazing, if you look at UNDP, which now I think more than 50% of its activities or budget now goes for essentially governance issues and so forth. But I can tell you 25 years ago, that was a dirty word. That was politics, they would never touch it. UNICEF, before the Convention on the Rights of the Child, would have never discussed human rights and so forth. UNICEF now adopted, actually was under an American leader at the time, adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child as their leitmotif and does amazing things now. And so, and the structures were put in place to allow, for example, country teams and so forth. So we're beginning to move in that direction. We're getting better at it. The unfortunate thing is this is coinciding now with a time where a lot of the fundamental elements of the system are actually being put down and kind of wound back. That's really too bad, because I think we were getting exactly along the lines, moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for raising. And can I just add to that, or you got to wrap things up?
No, it's okay.
Go, and it's very quick, because the current Secretary General Guterres has made prevention and sustained peace a priority, and it's all about trying to pull together these many aspects of what the UN does as being seen as preventive, serving a preventive function. But operationalizing conflict prevention is historically been very difficult, and that's not to say a couple of technical fixes are going to be the solution.
Oh, thank you. So I'd like to thank everyone on this panel for sharing their expertise and experiences this afternoon. These are invaluable insights on an important issue that is both influential on the affairs of states and the future of people worldwide. So next in our symposium, Ambassador Alan Rock will be giving the keynote address at 51 Winthrop at 6:30 on the liberal world correspondent. He actually also had his flight canceled and drove all the way from Ottawa.
Trees falling.